All right, so we're going to review the motions at the major joints. And just to remind you, the angular motion of flexion extension always occurs in the sagittal plane. The motion AB, adduction, always occurs in the frontal or coronal plane. And the rotational motion of medial and lateral rotation, or internal and external rotation, occur in the transverse and horizontal plane. So at the hip joint is a ball and socket joint, and it can flex and extend, AB and adduct, and medially and laterally rotate. So it can do all three motions. The knee joint is a simple hinge joint and can only flex and extend. And in the rare case, when it is flexed to 90 degrees, there is a very small amount of medial and lateral rotation. All right, moving down to the ankle joint, you plantar flex and dorsiflex. Most people don't refer to flexion and extension. They use these very specific terms, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, for the ankle joint. Plantar flexion is if you're up on your tiptoes. Dorsiflexion is if you're seated and you pull your toes toward your tibia. At the subtalar joint, okay, and that's the joint below your ankle joint. It's off axis. It's subtalar, so below the talus. And that allows the inversion and eversion. Inversion is when the soles of your feet are pointed towards each other or in, and eversion is when they are pointed out, the soles of your feet. Now, some people put inversion and eversion at the ankle joint, and we can discuss that more during our class time. All right, so the Metatarsophalangeal and the Interphalangeal joints. So that's between the metatarsals, and here are your phalanges. So at the Metatarsophalangeal joints, you can flex and extend, and AB and adduct. And AB and adducting is when you're like spreading your toes, and the midline of your foot for AB and adduction is your second toe. And then at your interphalangeal joints, or your toes, you can flex and extend your toes. All right, so now the upper limb, and it's almost a mirror image of the lower limb. First, we have the glenohumeral joint, sometimes called the shoulder joint. I don't call it the shoulder joint because sometimes the shoulder joint consists of the clavicle and the scapula for shoulder motion. So if you're talking about the gross motor movements at this, quote, shoulder joint, being flexion extension, AB adduction, and medial and lateral rotation, it's better to refer to it as the glenohumeral joint so people don't get confused. Up at the glenohumeral joint, because our scapula do not have a bony connection between them, it's only muscle, we are able to horizontally AB and adduct. Now, to get into horizontal abduction, you need to abduct your glenohumeral joint to 90 degrees, and then you start to do the motion as if you were doing a bench press or a push-up. You horizontally abduct is when it's in the down phase of a bench press, so your arms are going away from each other, and adduction is when they are almost touching. So horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. All right, the elbow joint, analogous to the knee joint, it can do flexion extension, fairly simple. The Radio-Ulnar Joint. Now, some people think this is the wrist joint. It is not. It is a very long joint between the radius and the ulna. Okay, and that is where pronation and supination occur. So it's rotating. If you put your palms up, kind of carrying the soup, that is supination. If you rotate so your palms are facing down, that is pronation. The wrist joint is the radio-carpal joint. And so when we're reviewing these motions, I invite you to grab proximal to your wrist and hold the radius and ulna rigid so they can't move, and see what motions occur at your wrist joint. And you'll see that you can flex and extend and AB and adduct. AB and adduction for the wrist joint are also called radial deviation when you're deviating to the side of your radius or your thumb side, and ulnar deviation when you're deviating towards your pinky side. Okay, your metacarpophalangeal joints, and then your phalanges of your hand. Metacarpophalangeal joint can do flexion extension and AB and adduction. The midline of these metacarpals are your middle finger or your third finger. That's the midline. And then for your phalanges or your fingers, they can flex and extend. The vertebral column, we'll separate it into cervical and lumbar. You can flex and extend. Flexion is when you are putting your chin toward your chest. Extension is the opposite. Lateral bend occurs in the frontal plane or the coronal plane. And since you're taking the midline of your head with you, so you say lateral bend to the right or lateral bend to the left. Same thing with rotation. There's no medial or lateral rotation because you're taking that midline with you, so you actually rotate to the right or actually rotate to the left. And the exact same thing occurs at your lumbar spine. Flexion and extension, lateral bend to the right, lateral bend to the left. Some people call this lateral flexion to the right and lateral flexion to the left. And then rotation to the right and rotation to the left. Circumduction. Sometimes you read about circumduction in many books. It is a multiplanar motion, and it only occurs at joints that can both flex and extend, and AB and adduct. And so I invite you to compile a list of all joints that can do circumduction.